Well, it seems like the days of consultancy firms living off the back of the taxpayer may be ending with a new Supreme Court ruling saying, no, you don't need to give funding for these outside non governmental organizations to do their own practice and influences across the world and, of course, within American society. And this is something we've been seeing in gaming, non governmental organizations getting money to subvert and change the gaming industry. And this is what people call the soft power influence of organizations like Sweetbaby Inc. Sweetbaby Inc. being the preeminent consultancy firm that has changed the video gaming industry for these past 10 years, infiltrating almost every single sequel that we loved that came out this past decade. I'm talking about Spider-Man, Alan Wake 2, God of War, so much titles that we have regarded as sacred cows that have been subverted and changed to play to progressive ideology. And this is what we're seeing happening within the video gaming industry. A strong case of these influences being drawn back because they may not have the money anymore to actually fund themselves and to continue on their influence. Of course, that's just a maybe, but we'll go into the details later. But if you don't know what I'm talking about on August 21st, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a 5-4 decision that allowed the current presidential administration to slash nearly $800 million in federal funding for research grants tied to DEI initiatives. DEI initiatives are usually focused on bringing about progressive causes to the forefront of any organization that is receiving this money. Of course, this goes to the National Health Institute. This goes to grants concerning climate change. This goes to grants concerning military. It goes to even piloting licenses and all these other organizations like health and security. It's widespread and highly influenceable across many governmental organizations. And it goes past government organizations. It goes directly to corporatized organizations. And that's what we're seeing with the influences beyond that, stretching out to the video gaming world, where the video gaming world has been directly influenced by these organizations and what the content that they actually do produce. And that's what we see these initiatives being at the forefront of so many games that have come out these past few years, where the programs became some way of irreparably changing many cultural influences in society. And that is why the Supreme Court decision is a massive change of what we're seeing, where these influences are at the forefront of every single game that is coming out. You could just see what recently came out at the Gamescom show, where we had all these great games here or there, but then we had these DEI influences that are there about representation, about fascism, about progressive ideals. And that was the thing that we saw at the focus of a lot of these organizations that are being influenced by maybe government funding and by other corporate links that are getting government backing to support these causes. And I think this is the thing that we're seeing already in the gaming industry, where companies relying on federal partnership or grants for DEI consulting saw investors pull back once the Supreme Court decision was made, where they're going, okay, we might get lawsuits now, which is something that has been happening consistently across the board since this current presidential administration is adversarial to these ideas of these initiatives. So now people are fearing lawsuits. They're pulling back their investments into any content or anything related to these ideals and initiatives. And that's what we're seeing now. There may be no money to push these ideals. And that is what we're seeing now as a downfall of consultancy firms like Sweetbaby Inc. and, of course, Hit Detection, which is kind of a sister company doing a similar thing. And that is this how we zoom into this situation right now, where Sweetbaby Inc., the organization, is being put in a tough position. Sweetbaby Inc. is one of the consultancy firms which specializes in injecting DEI elements into gaming narratives. These outfits promise inclusive storytelling, but face massive backlash for allegedly ruining games with forced diversity, forced progressive ideology, LGBTQ activism, all these other elements that people weren't really interested in, but saw them at the forefront of the games that they were playing. And of course, Sweetbaby Inc., founded by former Ubisoft developers, worked on titles like Kill the Justice League. They worked on God of War, Ragnarok, Spider-Man 2, Alan Wake 2, Forspoken, Dustborn, Awakening Unknown 9, all these titles that have kind of a bad reputation, if not some success, but lacking in the similar successes of their predecessors. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people are noticing with these programs, with these consultancy firms that lend their advice. They usually lead to disaster for a company. And I think that's the narrative that has taken shape and control in the video gaming industry, because these organizations, they position themselves as narrative experts, but critics accuse them of prioritizing their personal politics over player enjoyment. Post-Supreme Court ruling, funding is drying up, and I think that's the thing that we're seeing occurring now with all the properties that they have put out being consecutive failures. It seems like a lot of these companies that got governmental money are seeing those ends quickly evaporating before their eyes. And I think this is what we're seeing with a lot of the reports of organizations cutting ties with Sweetbaby quietly or just making them a silent partner in some of their already signed deals. And that's what we're hearing from Square Enix. Other clients from Sony are cutting ties with their multiple projects connected to Sweetbaby Inc. And I think this is why the funding loss is happening now. With the Supreme Court decision emboldening private investors to withdraw supporting DEI-linked entities, BlackRock and other funds are already facing anti-ESG, environmental social governance pressure. If you don't know BlackRock and Vanguard created ESG, environmental social governance, which led to DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. They were at the forefront. These two $10 trillion investment banking firms were at the forefront of pushing this ideology and supported a lot of these consultancy firms and organizations with government funding and many other sources of funding to support it. And now that government funding is threatened, that government funding that usually went straight into consultancy firms similar to Sweetbaby Inc. are now having a tough time getting the backing and support that they usually have to be put in a position of influencing the gaming industry. And this is what we're seeing right now with a lot of properties right now. Funding is being lost because of this anti-DEI atmosphere where a lot of companies were already pulling back, and now we have Supreme Court approval of this ideology being used as a reference now, where it doesn't really matter if you go to a court case, they use that Supreme Court ruling as a reference, and all government funding is probably going to evaporate for this organization. That any money that BlackRock got that they funneled in will have to come directly from their own purse, which a lot of these organizations really don't do. They usually take money from the government to use in their own way. They don't want to use their own money for these organizations. And that's why I think gaming is going to be put in a position where a lot of titles that used to come out that had these initial markings of these organizations are not going to have that wealth supporting them anymore. And I think the same thing is happening in hit detection, often called Sweetbaby Inc. 2.0. It's facing a similar fate. If you don't know, Hit Detection, they worked on multiple video games within the industry. Recently, they worked with Silent Hill 2 Remaster, which is an okay remaster, but had some problems with the character designs that many people complained about in comparison to the non-remaster version of the game. And I think this is the thing that we keep seeing with these organizations, where they're going to be put in a tighter spot where a lot of the gaming consultancy firms, a lot of these consultancy firms, which always attack the gamers, that's something that Sweetbaby Inc. did, something that Hit Detection did as well, is going to find themselves in a tight spot because the very gamers that they're attacking are now the ones that they need to depend on for their success, because the government funding is not going to come there and support them anymore. And I think the time where they thrive with these grants and subsidies coming to these organizations are over right now. Private money is going to be tight to come by. I think investors are going to see DEI as a liability rather than a plus one that is going to lead to extra government backing. And I think that's the thing that has been favoring a lot of these organizational initiatives, because these initiatives allow you to make terrible games, because where you don't have to depend on the fan base for their acceptance. And this is why we see organizations like Ubisoft, like Insomniac, like all these other organizations where they're not concerned about the success of the game anymore. They know they're going to get the money to produce another one, so they're okay to some certain extent. And this is why you see companies like Sweetbaby Inc. and all these consultancy firms, they don't really care about the success or failures of the games, because they're going to be able to sustain themselves based on the government backing and money being funneled to them. At least that's my theory of the situation, because I think that's the thing that's keeping them afloat, because even with the failures, they keep getting hired again and again because of government initiatives saying this is a part of our modus operandi. We want these things being present all over the gaming industry, all over cultural industries. And I think with that push back from the Supreme Court saying, hey, this is illegal, we're against this, that is just showing that, hey, there's going to be a pushback if you do follow these initiatives that are kind of anti-ethical to equality, gender, and race, which is kind of the foundation of what we see here, where DEI is essentially exclusionary while it proclaims its inclusivity. And I think that's always the dynamic a lot of people saw with DEI initiatives, where it's excluding a lot of people to maintain a minority of people. And I think that exclusionary perspective created a lot of antagonism against it, because it creates class kind of system within itself where people are seen as the oppressors and victims need to be raised up. And I think this is the thing that created that backlash within the gaming world, where people are like, hey, I'm just trying to play games. You're trying to bring in these social politics that have nothing to do with what I'm here to play games for. And that resulted in the massive failures that we saw in the gaming industry these past few years, where we had the Concords that were massive failures, lost over $400 million. That's where we saw the Kill the Justice League that barely got 13,000 players at its all-time high, and consistently goes down to lower numbers, where it is a $250 million failure, where we have Dustborn, where it's barely able to scrap 50 people to play, and its entire funding comes from governmental funds from USAID. And that is just what we're seeing now, the consistent backing of terrible games. Same thing with Dragon Age Veilguard, which is a massive failure that was mostly focused on LGBTQ nonsense and lost the fantasy of the world that it once stood for. And we see this with so much other titles that have come out these past few years that have been inundated with these ideologies. And I think these failures, combined with the lack of funding, it's going to lead to a complete change in the video gaming industry, because there's just no more money for this nonsense anymore. If you have to depend on your own funding, which a lot of developers already have to do, the developers are really not usually getting the government backing. And if they are, it's not going to be enough to tank your entire studio. And I think this is the thing that we're seeing now, combined with the Supreme Court ruling, where you have a threat of lawsuit, where now you may get funding for your game, but you may get sued out of existence to even create this game. And I think that double threats are going to lead to people to just walk away from producing content like this, because industry-wide, over $1 billion have been lost on these AAA flops. Games with DEI chin or black girl boss leads have often been derided because they are a representation of the things that we often see when these organizations are trying to tout their personal ideology to the fan base. And I think the pattern recognition is too obvious for gamers, where gamers already know what they're going to get when the game is released, because it has a certain look, and a certain look identifies what you're getting from the game developers, and it's not good gaming. And I think these things are going to lead to a massive drop-off of these sort of titles. And I think the Supreme Court ruling was kind of the last nail in the coffin, or at least for most gamers that were anticipating more content like this. Of course, we have the stragglers. More games are going to come out like this, but I think for the future of gaming, there's going to be a lot less support for these type of entities, at least for the next 4 years. I think the 4 years after that, people will probably be pivoted far enough where they're not going to go back, even if the administration changes into something that's more friendly to these elements. People are going to be too attached to the money they're making from the new games that they're making to make anything from the old style, from the DEI years, which I think that's what's going to be called this past decade, the DEI years, where all money was lost in gaming and only the strong survived. And it seemed like the strong are surviving well enough nowadays. But that's just my 2 cents on the situation. Maybe you disagree with me. Maybe you think there's still money out there for DEI projects. Certainly there could be. BlackRock still has trillions of dollars that could push this if they want. The CEO just became the head of the World Economic Forum, so he has even more influence and power. So the power players are still there. I think we just have to wait and see if these people are still going to fight back, which just seems to be the case with all these age verification laws and all these UK's online safety acts. I think we're going to have a bigger fight for these positions in gaming censorship than for these DEI initiatives. I think DEI is probably dead in gaming, but that's just my thoughts. Tell me what you think. Like, comment, share, subscribe. This Wagner Knows Why. Catch you next time.